Signpost number 5, again and again. Much of what we learn about our friends, enemies too, we learn by noticing patterns. This lesson, again and again, is about some of those patterns. In this case, the pattern is repetition. When something happens over and over again, that repetition begins to tell us something if we notice it and give it some thought. For example, one day you may be sitting with a few friends when another one joins you. One of the original group grows quiet and after a few minutes gets up and leaves. You may not think anything of it at that moment, but if it happens again the next day and then again the next week, you'll probably notice it. It's the pattern, the repetition, the event that occurs again and again that lets you know something is up, if you notice it, and if you think about it. Obviously, noticing it isn't enough. You have to do something with what you've noticed or it's lost. You have to wonder about it, speculate about what it might mean, and perhaps compare it with other incidents, or it won't help you understand what's going on. So you make some mental or actual notes about that repetition and what it might mean. Ultimately, you'll figure it out. Your friends may have had a falling out, or perhaps they've discovered that they're in competition for the same prize. Or maybe, on the other hand, they've realized that they like each other more than they thought, and they don't know what to do about that. The event may not seem significant at all the first time it occurs, but by the third time, you'll begin to wonder what's going on and start watching your friends more closely. You'll probably ask yourself something like, why does this happen again and again? Again and again moments also happen in books. When authors repeat something, a word or an image or an event, it means something. And when we see those words or images or events again and again, we ought to stop and ask ourselves, why does this happen again and again? The answer will generally tell us something about the character or the plot, or perhaps even the theme or life lesson or message of the story. Now let's look for this lesson in a book you might have read, Hatchet by Gary Paulson. Follow along as I read from the first pages of the opening chapter. Brian, the main character, is seated next to the pilot in a small plane flying over the forests in the far north. Brian Robertson stared out the window of the small plane at the endless green northern wilderness below. It was a small plane, a Cessna 406, a bush plane, and the engine was so loud, so roaring and consuming and loud, that it ruined any chance for conversation. Not that he had much to say. He was 13 and the only passenger on the plane with a pilot named, what was it, Jim or Jake or something, who was in his mid-40s and who had been silent as he worked to prepare for takeoff. In fact, since Brian had come to the small airport in Hampton, New York to meet the plane, driven by his mother, the pilot had spoken only 5 words to him: get in the co-pilot's seat, which Brian had done. They had taken off, and that was the last of the conversation. There had been the initial excitement, of course. He had never flown in a single-engine plane before, and to be sitting in the co-pilot seat with all the controls right there in front of him, all of the instruments in his face as the plane clawed for altitude, jerking and sliding on the wind currents as the pilot took off, had been interesting and exciting. Now Brian sat looking out the window with the roar thundering through his ears and tried to catalog what had led up to his taking this flight. The thinking started. Always it started with a single word: divorce. It was an ugly word, he thought, a tearing, ugly word that meant fights and yelling. Lawyers, God, he thought, how he hated lawyers who sat with their comfortable smiles and tried to explain to him in legal terms how all that he lived in was coming apart. And the breaking and shattering of all the solid things, his home, his life, all the solid things. Divorce, a breaking word, an ugly breaking word. Let's pause for a moment. I noticed right away that Paulson is using the again and again signpost. Paulson has Brian speak the word divorce twice. He emphasizes it too by letting it stand alone as a one-word sentence. And Brian has obviously thought of it many times before because he says that his thinking always started with that word. If the thinking always starts this way, he's thought of divorce many times before. Now at this point, I don't know exactly how divorce plays a part in this story. I can guess that his parents are probably divorced, but I have no idea what that has to do with his situation at the moment, being in a small plane flying over the North Woods. I'll ask myself the anchor question, why does this keep showing up again and again? At this point, I don't have a good answer, but I can bet that divorce will be mentioned again. Let's read on. Divorce. Secrets. No, not secrets so much as the secret. What he knew and had not told anybody. What he knew about his mother that had caused the divorce. What he knew. The secret. Divorce. The secret. That was quick. Just a few more lines and we see the author using this strategy, repetition, yet again. What have you spotted in this passage? See how many possible answers to our anchor question you can come up with. You should have spotted that divorce was repeated several more times, and you probably noticed the repeated mention of the secret. So we're beginning to see that Brian knows something about the breakup, something that he's never shared. But why do you think this is important? Why is Paulson driving this home again and again? What are we learning about the character and his situation? Perhaps Brian feels very alone. Perhaps that feeling is going to become important as the story progresses. Let's read on. This moment, as I read, I'm going to pay attention to anything that is repeated because it's something that the author probably wants us to notice. Brian felt his eyes beginning to burn and knew there would be tears. He had cried for a time, but that was gone now. He didn't cry now. The pilot sat large, his hands lightly on the wheel, feet on the rudder pedals. He seemed more a machine than a man, an extension of the plane. When he saw Brian look at him, the pilot seemed to open up a bit, and he smiled. Ever fly in the co-pilot's seat before? He leaned over and lifted the headset off his right ear and put it on his temple, yelling to overcome the sound of the engine. Brian shook his head. It's not as complicated as it looks. Good plane like this almost flies itself. The pilot shrugged. Makes my job easy. He took Brian's left arm. Here, put your hands on the controls, your feet on the rudder pedals, and I'll show you what I mean. Brian shook his head. I'd better not. Sure, try it. Brian reached out and took the wheel in a grip so tight his knuckles were white. He pushed his feet down on the pedals. The plane slewed suddenly to the right. Not so hard. Take her light. Take her light. Brian eased off, relaxing his grip. The burning in his eyes was forgotten momentarily as the vibration of the plane came through the wheel and the pedals. It seemed almost alive. See? The pilot let go of his wheel, raised his hands in the air, and took his feet off the pedals to show Brian he was actually flying the plane alone. Simple! Now turn the wheel a little to the right and push on the right rudder pedal a small amount. Brian turned the wheel slightly and the plane immediately banked to the right, and when he pressed on the right rudder pedal, the nose slid across the horizon to the right. He left off on the pressure and straightened the wheel, and the plane righted itself. Now you can turn. Bring her back to the left a little. Brian turned the wheel left, pushed on the left pedal, and the plane came back around. It's easy, he smiled. At least this part. The pilot nodded. All of flying is easy. It just takes learning, like everything else. He took the controls back, then reached up and rubbed his left shoulder. Aches and pains. Must be getting old. Brian let go of the controls and moved his feet away from the pedals as the pilot put his hands on the wheel. Thank you. But the pilot had put his headset back on, and the gratitude was lost in the engine noise, and things went back to Brian looking out the window at the ocean of trees and lakes. The burning eyes did not come back, but memories did, came flooding in. The words, always the words. Divorce, the secret, fights, split, the big split. Brian's father did not understand as Brian did, knew only that Brian's mother wanted to break the marriage apart. The split had come, and then the divorce, all so fast, and the court had left him with his mother, except for the summers, and what the judge called visitation rights. So formal. That was a long passage. What repetitions did you notice? You should have noticed that another word is beginning to appear again and again. Secret. And you notice that it's apparently important because it's capitalized. Brian knows the secret that caused the divorce, and he hasn't told anyone about it. When we ask why the author might be returning to this again and again, what can we say? All that we know with certainty is how deeply troubled Brian is, but we've also thought about how alone he must feel with his parents splitting up. And he must feel alone in that small cockpit with a pilot who barely speaks. As we read on in the novel, we'll have to see if this divorce and his feeling so alone because of it play as important a role in the story as what we've been led to expect. So now let's practice on our own with a different text. Practice identifying what's repeated again and again and asking the question, why? Why does this keep happening again and again?